welcome to GrowSmart Maine's short-term rental webinar. My name is Maggie Fleming. I'm a former GrowSmart Maine board member, and I'm also assistant town manager for the town of Falmouth, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. And we have three distinguished panelists with us today: Noel Musson, who's a principal and a planner at the Musson Group; Tim Carr, who's a senior planner at the Land Use Planning Commission; Michael Roy, who's town manager of Greenville, Maine. And we'd like to thank our webinar sponsor, Kennebec Savings Bank. I'd also like to note that this webinar is part of GrowSmart Maine's educational outreach as a participant in the Department of Economic and Community Development Housing Opportunity Program, which is aimed at encouraging and supporting the development of additional housing units in the state. I'd also like to take a moment to honor the people of the Wabanaki Confederacy, the Penobscot, the Passamaquoddy, the Maliseet, and the Micmac peoples. These people are the traditional inhabitants of the lands of the state of Maine, and no matter where you're watching from today in Maine, you are in traditional Wabanaki territory. And in thinking about your personal relationship with Maine and future opportunities for the state during today's webinar, please consider the relationship that members of the Wabanaki Confederacy have shared and continue to share with this place as well. So why are we here today? Short-term rentals can provide much needed income and support local economies, but they can also impact the availability of longer-term rental housing and housing prices. And while this balance will be different for each community, being aware of the trends and tools available to manage short-term rentals is key for communities to make informed decisions for smart growth. And just to go through the agenda quickly, today's program will be 90 minutes, and we'll leave time for audience Q&A at the end. And I encourage you to turn on your videos, but please remember to keep yourself on mute during the panel. And if you would like to ask a question during the Q&A, please raise your hand or type questions into the Q&A box. I think it might actually be the chat box. Yes, it's the chat box. And today's webinar will be recorded and posted on our YouTube channel. And we'll send a feedback survey as well after the webinar. So I want to get started and have our panelists take a few minutes to introduce themselves. So we'll start with Noel.
Hi, thank you, Maggie. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. My name is Noel Musson. I'm a principal planner at the Musson Group. We're located in Southwest Harbor on Mount Desert Island. But I've worked all around the state of Maine. Started off my career in Harpswell. We've worked all the way up in Presque Isle and other places in between. Have a lot of experience working with communities on creating ordinances and working in tourism-related areas, many of which are dealing with this particular topic as we speak. So happy to be here and look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Noel. Mike, you can go next.
Good afternoon, Maggie. Thank you for having me. My name is Mike Roy. I'm the Greenville town manager. I've been in this chair for almost 5 years now. In my prior life, I was an operations manager at FedEx Express, retiring as manager in Augusta, Bangor, and Presque Isle. So I know quite a bit of the state. It's a great opportunity that you bring this to everyone so we can figure out all the short-term rental challenges. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. And last but not least, Tim.
Thanks, Maggie. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tim Carr, a senior planner with the Land Use Planning Commission, and I've been involved with the commission's data gathering and rulemaking on short-term rentals. Like many on the LUPC staff, both past and present, I actually don't have a background in planning. My background's been in environmental science and education. I've learned a lot in the past 5 years about planning and also about Maine, as I'm not originally from Maine. I thought to just share a few slides to provide an overview to the Land Use Planning Commission in case some of the audience isn't familiar. So I'll see if I can get that to work.
Great.
All right, how's that?
We can see it.
Great. So the Land Use Planning Commission is a state level agency. It's formally known as LURC, the Land Use Regulation Commission. And we serve as the planning, zoning, and permitting authority for the unorganized and deorganized areas of the state, as well as a few towns that contract for our services. And here are some basic statistics. It's a vast region. It's approximately half the area of the state, although it's very sparsely populated. It includes areas fairly diverse kind of range from Monhegan Island to Grand Lake Stream, to areas around Millinocket, the Moosehead region, and Rangeley. And so just here on the slide, most of the planning shop is located in Augusta and Bangor, and then we have field offices that handle a lot of permitting in other locations that are the stars on the map. So all the shaded area are the different regions that we cover. Let's see if I can advance this. There we go. I did just want to briefly mention all the other LUPC staff that have been involved in some of the things I'll be speaking about today, because it certainly has been a big team effort. It's been going on for about 2 years. This is our research and policy development. And so these are some of my colleagues that have been involved. And on the right there is just a list of what we've been engaged in so far. And then a link to our webpage on short-term rentals. And then lastly, just to kind of provide an overview of some data that help kind of focus some things I'll talk about today. These are some results we got from looking at Airbnb and VRBO listings from AirDNA in 2021. And so this is just a heat map that shows the range of active short-term rentals across the LUPC service area. And you can see particular concentrations in the Millinocket area, the Rangeley area, and the Moosehead area in particular. And you can see the range of sort of active listings, at least of a couple of years ago. And let's see, I will stop sharing.
Thanks, Tim.
All right, thank you.
So I think we'll go ahead and get into some of my questions, and then we'll do Q&A with the audience at the end. I'll just have the panelists jump in when they feel like they're ready to answer, and I might prompt a few of them. But we'll start with, if you can tell me what's happening with the short-term rental environment in the communities you work with. And I don't know if Mike wants to start with this and talk about Greenville. Oh, Mike, you're on mute.
I apologize. What's happening with short-term rentals here in Greenville? Well, there's more short-term rentals than there are long-term rentals, probably 50-1 if I had to guess. And the problem is that, there's no housing, attainable housing, affordable housing for employees to work at our local businesses. So local businesses are having to actually buy homes and provide housing for their employees. But on the flip side, it's good that we have these short-term rentals because we lack hotel space or, those type of inns. The inns are full, the hotels are full, which is not many, right? We have like 2 inns and 1 hotel. And it's so the short-term rentals are offsetting the need of housing for vacationers and tourists. Greenville's become a destination, and we want people to come here. We want people to live and work and play here. But the affordability of housing now, driven by people buying older homes and remodeling them, and putting them on them up for rent on VRBO or something like that. So that's very challenging for us. Try to find that balance.
Thanks, Mike.
Want me to jump in?
Sure.
Yeah, so I think for me and the Musson Group, we're working with a lot of coastal communities, a lot of tourism communities, and we're wrestling with a lot of the same things Mike just talked about. Really struggling with having conversations about the long-term or the historical use of short-term rentals that is pretty prevalent in some of these communities where people have rented their homes out for a long time to help pay for property taxes and those kinds of things. And then the accelerated demand for those uses, and then turning those uses, that short-term rental, more into an investment business, and those kinds of activities. And so, one of the things that I found has been really interesting, at least on Mount Desert Island, is back around 2015, we participated in a housing study. And at that point, the study indicated that there were only 11 listings on Airbnb. And I'm not sure if that's 100% accurate. I'm sure there were way more than 11 short-term rentals at the time, but that was for all of Mount Desert Island. And then, fast forward to 2022, 23 timeframe, just in one town, there were over 400 short-term rentals, which was about 18, close to 18% or 19% of the total housing stock in that community. And so, a lot of the towns that we're working with are starting this conversation of trying to understand, like, wow, this thing really is happening. How do we balance out that use with the implications that it has for year-round communities and neighborhoods and all the things that, I'm sure we're going to talk about a little bit more today. So that's where we are.
Thanks, Noel. Tim, do you want to speak to your communities with LUPC?
Sure. I mean, like a lot of Maine, the unorganized territories have a long history of vacation rentals. And definitely, I'd say in the past kind of 15 to 25 years, there's been a lot of property improvement, a lot of winterization of camps and cabins that have then allowed for multi-season use. And then thinking of kind of pre-COVID until now, we definitely think there's been an increase in the frequency of STR use. So it's happening more frequently and happening more frequently across multiple seasons. It's a little bit less clear to us whether there's been a really significant increase in the number of STR listings since the pandemic. Looking at the AirDNA data, which compiles Airbnb and VRBO data, we see a lot of heterogeneity across the large service area. So some AirDNA markets show increases, although a lot of times that's kind of minimal in the number of listings. Some show kind of steady listings over the past 5 years, and some show some decreases. And so, and it's also hard for us to kind of tease that out because all the AirDNA markets they're usually centered around a municipality. And so they're aggregating data from the unorganized territories and the municipality. But as I showed on the slide before, we do know where STR activity is primarily concentrated in the region. It's Moosehead, Rangeley, and Millinocket, where we're seeing the most activity. And then the places that we tend to receive complaints from are more densely developed residential subdivisions in those particular areas. And that's part of what kind of motivated our provided the impetus for us to gather data and develop some rules. So, one thing that's interesting is that the HOAs in some of those areas, they do or potentially could develop, they have the authority to develop rules around short-term rentals. But as far as I know, they've generally been reluctant to touch that.
Thanks, Tim. So my next question is, and you all touched on this a little bit, but have you seen community benefits to having short-term rentals? And if you have, in the communities you're working in, what are some of those?
So I can speak to that definitely. Like myself, people come here for a weekend or a week, and next thing you know, you want to live here. And that's what happens with these short-term rentals. They come up and they just love the disconnect, if you will. They love coming over the hill and seeing the lake and the beauty and the proximity to all the trails, whether it's hiking, biking, snowmobiling, or ATVing. They just love the area and what it has to offer. So when they come, they start looking around and they start looking at real estate, and next thing you know, We have new subdivisions, we have new homes going in those subdivisions, and so, yeah, that's a benefit. There's no question about it. And it has increased our school population. You know, that's always a concern. We have a school that's pre-K, 4-year-olds to 12th grade, and we have like 186 kids in the whole school. So we want to keep that school open. So having the short-term rental kind of introduces a family, if you will, to the area, and if they're lucky enough to work remotely, then they end up moving here. So that is definitely a benefit.
Thanks, Mike. Noel or Tim, do you want to chime in?
No, I agree. I think there's a lot of benefits that you can see by that activity. You know, in places like other towns on Mount Desert Island that have less hotel accommodations than a place like Bar Harbor, short-term rentals provide that access to the tourism, you know, visitors that come here and want to go to restaurants or shop in different downtown areas. There's lots of families around here and some of the other communities who have been around for a long time and need to use that, you know, resource as a way to be able to stay at their property. So we've seen, you know, definitely seen benefits from that activity.
Thanks.
Yeah, I would just kind of reiterate what both Noel and Mike have said. This past summer, LUPC held community information gathering meetings in Millinocket, Moosehead, and Rangeley areas. And a lot of the attendees emphasized the same points that Noel and Mike have already made.
Great. And you've touched on this as well, but do you want to add anything around challenges that short-term rentals have proposed for your communities?
Sure, I can add some of that. Biggest challenges are trash, right? It creates more trash because the turnovers can be 2 or 3 times a week, and it just generates a lot more trash. And where we are, you know, we have to haul our trash down a Norwich Walk, and the trucking, the transportation, and the tipping fees are just huge. You know, the transfer station budget is probably in the top 5. The trash is in the top 5 expense for the town. So that is definitely a huge challenge. You know, we have you know, the streets are open to ATVs, so we get not a lot. So, but we get a few complaints from local people that ATVs have kind of wandered onto a road that may not be allowed on, and so, you know, that's kind of a challenge for the police department. We handle that, and with more signage, and the ATV clubs helps us out with that. You know, we don't have a lot of police calls due to short-term rentals. So that is not what I'm saying at all. So it's just people who just don't know where they have to be. All right, so that's basically information and signage. But the biggest challenge we have is the trash.
Yeah, I mean, I would add a couple of different things to that. So on the sort of the land use side of things, you know, in addition to trash and some other communities that have like public infrastructure, so there's an added draw to the water and sewer system that needs to get offset somehow. That's different than a residential use. There's also sort of the neighborhood context of some areas that are changing more from year-round neighborhoods to more seasonal neighborhoods. You know, there is some noise in some communities. People bring up the noise and sort of I'll call them the neighborly issues that kind of gets put into that what I'll call land use bucket. And then you know, the bigger picture that we're dealing with here is how and whether or not short-term rentals contribute to the lack of year-round housing availability, not just year-round housing availability, but also housing availability for workers. You know, even during the season, where some, you know, houses that used to be primarily for, you know, like College of the Atlantic students, and then they turn over to workers for the summer students. Those aren't available anymore because they've been converted to short-term rentals. So that drives the businesses to look at other opportunities. Sometimes they have to buy a house or, we have to start creating code that allows for different types of creative developments that's different than, those are, things that we have to, that we're starting to think about. There's some social divisiveness that we have to start to think about in terms of that issue as well. How, the fors and the againsts, I guess, conversation that sometimes we get into in public meetings. So it's, it's an interesting challenge, and it's definitely pros and cons that we're trying to find a balance to both of those as we work through these things.
Thanks, Noel.
And
Tim?
Maggie, if I may add,
Mhm.
just I will echo Noel on the housing. I mean, that is a huge challenge for long-term rentals and employee housing. That is definitely a challenge. Thank you.
Thanks. Tim, did you want to add anything?
I would, I just echo what Noel and Mike said. We've certainly heard about all those issues. We've heard about safety issues as well. So a lot of people coming from out of town may not understand or know about local safety laws, headway speed or something if they brought their boat, where they need to ride their ATVs or snowmobiles. Of course, increase in traffic in some of our residential subdivisions, changing the neighborhood character, increasing road maintenance costs and issues. And we've also heard a lot of concerns about septic capacity. And so, most of our properties are on a residential septic system. And you can imagine that with the increase in frequency of STR use, people adding beds to fit in more guests, that oftentimes the actual septic system flow may exceed the design flow of the system. And of course, that can have potential negative effects, especially around lakes with excessive nutrient loading. So that's certainly something that the LUPC has been interested in addressing. Some of the AirDNA data that we looked at indicated that around 50% of listings were trying to fit in more than 2 guests per bedroom, at least as a maximum. And, as a general rule of thumb, septic systems are designed sort of with the idea of 2 kind of long-term residents per bedroom. So, there's some indication definitely that the number of guests might be exceeding capacities.
Thanks. And another question, how are your communities thinking about handling this or doing anything to manage short-term rentals, whether that be ordinances or policies, or if you haven't put anything in place, what have you been talking about?
So our planning board has really just started diving into this, and we're looking at other communities for examples and how they're handling it. So we here in Greenville have not gone, it's not too far into it yet, but they are discussing it in our planning board meetings.
Yeah, so a lot of the towns that we're, generally when the towns have already been kind of talking about something before they come to somebody like me to help them, create ordinances. But I think a lot of the communities are looking at, do we put in some sort of registration process just so we can get more accurate data on the numbers of short-term rentals and the kinds of short-term rentals, so that we can then, have a truer understanding for a specific community about, what is the issue that we're trying to identify and what we want to accomplish with that, all the way to, we're creating ordinances that actually limit the number of certain types of short-term rentals. We've started categorizing things, and I like to think about them in 3 ways. So the short-term rental being the thing that is like your primary residence, and you're renting it as a short-term rental. And then started using the term vacation rental, which is more like an investment property that you're using for short-term rentals. And then and around a lot of the communities that we have a lot of seasonal structures. So they're always just like a camp, probably similar to what's in LUPC land, or a lot of places in Greenville, I would imagine, that are very seasonal, but are now starting to get rented out. And some of those things have different implications. So we're really working with communities to just try to figure out what their overarching goal is in terms of the regulatory approach, or what it is that they're trying to understand. And generally it's, let's understand the problem, and then we can start to think about, what tools need to be applied to address that problem.
Thanks, Noel. Tim, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, well, the LUPC is actually in the midst of drafting STR related rules, and one of my colleagues who's on this call, Stacy Benjamin, I think will be bringing those draft rules to the commission in February. So I can't go into particular detail. We're still tweaking and fine tuning some things, but I can give you an idea of the basic approach that the commission has asked us to pursue. And that's adopting STR specific standards and a notification approach. And so the standards require STR owners to notify the LUPC about their STR and provide some basic information. And then at the same time to self-verify that the STR standards are met. And then to kind of go hand in hand with that approach, we're also developing educational and guidance materials that STR operators and neighbors can use, as well as kind of a web page will be part of that, which will be a place that both STR neighbors and operators can go to get information. And so we kind of decided to take a notification approach at this point, rather than jump, fully into a permitting style approach, for some of the reasons that Noel already mentioned. It's going to help us gather more information, which we feel like we definitely need. It does provide a basis for enforcement and addressing some particular issues that we know residents of the property owners in the LUPC area are very concerned about. This does put a kind of minimal burden on staff. We were very concerned, given the size of our staff, with having to process a lot of additional permits, in particular enforcement that might end up being involved with that. But we definitely found from our community meetings that the educational piece was going to be really key. And so I think both staff and the commission have felt good about putting some resources into developing those sorts of things.
Thanks, Tim. And what advice do you all have for communities who are just beginning to gather data or think about managing their short-term rentals? And Noel, if you want to start with this question.
Sure. Yeah, no, my first word of advice is to recognize that this is a really emotional topic for a lot of people on one side or the other, and that it can be, in some cases, it's you're talking about people's livelihoods. And in other cases, you're talking about people really wanting to be in a community that just can't be there because there's no opportunities. So it's a real emotional place to be sometimes, particularly in public meetings and those things. So, I like to start with an understanding of how are we going to define a balance of this particular use in a community, and then try to identify what is the problem that you're trying to address. So are you really trying to address the issues that are associated with the structural safety of short-term rentals, or the implications of septic system use or overuse, as Tim mentioned, or are you trying to deal with lack of year-round housing availability and the role that a short-term rental might play in your community? And certain tools, as I said earlier, can apply depending on what what your objectives are.
Thanks, Noel.
Sure, just to kind of piggyback on that, I would absolutely reiterate everything Noel said. For us, we held these community meetings, which were very much part of kind of helping us understand and define the problem and focus in on the particular issues that we needed to address. And those were very valuable. So it's getting out and speaking to people, holding those sorts of meetings is key. We had a web page with materials on it, which was really useful to helping orient people. We had a plan going in, excuse me, going into the meetings, which I also think was very helpful. That plan involved, brief presentation by LUPC staff, an activity by which the people attending could go around to different stations and answer particular questions. So we had a set of 4 questions around STRs, very similar to the questions we're addressing today, that we wanted to get feedback on, and people wrote sticky notes and posted them on a board. And then we usually had a staff member at each station to engage in further discussion. And then after that, we just had kind of general open community discussion. And that was a great framework. We sometimes did have to emphasize that at that stage, we were very much involved in information gathering. That was our point there, and that we weren't making any particular, determinations. And then, of course, having discussions with other agencies was key to us. Around the septic piece, discussion with DHHS was important. And I meant to mention earlier, in September of this past year, there was an update to the DHHS subsurface disposal rules. And so there are STR specific rules now in which the design flows for STRs need to be greater than the typical residential design flow. So that might be something of interest to the audience.
Yeah, I think those are all, I just want to support all that, like coming into the public process or the beginning of the process with a pretty good and well-defined approach to the outreach and what it is you're asking for will really be helpful, so that you're not coming into it saying you're going to do a regulation. It's, doing exactly what Tim described, thinking about learning more about what the issues are, so that then you can go back and be thoughtful about what problem it is that you're trying to address, through that process. So that, I think, sounds like a really sound piece of advice.
Thanks. Yeah, and certainly, as part of our approach, we'll be bringing some draft rules to the commission in February, and if the commission might authorize us to post those rules, and then that will trigger a whole nother round of kind of feedback and review from the public. So we're not done yet.
So if I may add, Maggie, the LUPC and Tim and his group, they held a information seminar or gathering here in Greenville, and it wasn't necessarily for Greenville, but it was for the surrounding Moosehead Lake area. And Noel is correct. It is very emotional and some people get very passionate on both sides. And I know Tim is nodding because he remembers. It was very well attended, and I learned a lot. And I think the way the LUPC has this program or this information is excellent. It was well done. I would encourage any planning board or any town to mirror what they did, because I think it was very beneficial to this area.
Yeah, just to build on what Mike's saying, the other thing that I was thinking is, there's a lot of work in this topic that's already happening. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel in a lot of ways. So there's a lot of different models out there. So do some research too ahead of time. I mean, even we do research on all the towns in Maine and other places that are doing this type of work, so that we can create a structure, an ordinance structure or an approach that's tailored to a community, but built on the learning that other people have already done.
Yeah, I'd absolutely reiterate that point. We reviewed a lot of ordinances that are in place in Maine, but just given the nature of our jurisdiction, we also looked further afield for other places that might be similar, sort of unorganized areas in Colorado or the Adirondacks or something, these larger kind of regional areas where STR approaches have been developed. But if any audience members would like to get more information specifically about what the LUPC has done to date, they should feel free to reach out.
Thanks, Tim. And another question, do you all think that there could be regional or statewide approaches that might be helpful? And if so, do you have any ideas for potential solutions at a statewide or regional level? I know that LUPC is regional and that it's a large swath of the state.
I'm happy to jump in on that one. I think that would be a great idea. I don't have any solutions for it, but I think what we're seeing here, particularly on Mount Desert Island, is that one town, Bar Harbor, started the trend by regulating short-term rentals in a way that fit their needs. But that really just pushes the problem off to the communities around it. You know, we're on an island. We have individual towns, but we're really connected. So I think having some sort of statewide framework or statewide approach that's consistent would take a lot of the guesswork out of it, but also help alleviate the push of that particular issue, you know, down the line, which is what does happen.
I agree with Noel. I think, the state supplying some guidance, or the LUPCs supplying some guidance, and how towns can be, can move positively on this and try to get everybody's buy-in, and, balance that short-term rental, long-term rental, and how to police it, if you will, because that is a concern, right? How do you police it? What is the goal? I mean, you can charge a short-term rental a permit fee, but then what? I mean, whose job is it? How is it handled? What authority does that person go and say, Mr. Vacationer, you have to leave, you've been here too long? So, that kind of guidance would be great.
Yeah,
Yeah.
consistent fee structure, even on a regional scale, would be really helpful. If you have one town that's charging, higher fees, and then they can, people can just go to the next town. Again, that's just, something that would be a little consistency might be helpful. Sorry, Tim, didn't mean to interrupt you.
Two of the reasons that the LUPC decided to take a little bit lighter approach and just kind of go for a notification and self-verification of standards. One is that the UT is so heterogeneous. Our jurisdiction covers so many kind of regions. And so we could see in the future potentially, regions engaging in a community guided planning and zoning process in which there are particular tailored regulations, perhaps around STRs and other things that get developed. We have that in place right now for the Rangeley region. And we've engaged in community guided planning and zoning processes in the past. And STRs could certainly be an issue that might prompt UT residents to engage in those sorts of processes again. And then another reason that we opted for a kind of lighter approach at this point is that, we're unsure whether there's going to be some direction or some movement at the state level. And so as we're doing this information gathering and thinking about rules to develop, a number of those commissions on short-term rentals and housing were going on in the legislature. And so, we're also just taking a light approach in case something does happen to emerge at the state level.
Thank you. And my final question, and it's sort of a two-part question. How are having short-term rentals in your communities impacting smart growth, whether enhancing or impeding? And what role do short-term rentals play in the larger long-term visions for your communities?
So I will chime in on the affordable housing part. That's no longer here in Greenville. It's for your restaurant person, working in a restaurant or at the local grocery store, the affordable housing, it's not there, unfortunately. So, we need to find that balance of long-term housing, short-term housing again. It's unfortunate. We want people to come here and live and raise their families, but it's the real estate has gone through the roof.
Yeah, I think I would agree that short-term rentals, you know, sometimes I try to think about this in the sort of like a pie shape of issues that you have to deal with as it relates to affordability. And, you know, short-term rentals is one slice in that pie. Obviously, we're also up against, you know, here on MDI, it's a very desirable place to be, similar to Greenville. And that always drives up the price of housing. So the supply and the demand is a factor in that, and short-term rentals definitely contributes to the availability of affordable or year-round housing options. And I think to answer the smart growth question is it really depends on the community. You know, sometimes you know, where short-term rentals are developed, you get to the development stage where you start to think about, you know, how and where the concentration of short-term rentals should be, and how they mix in with other goals of your community, whether or not, you know, this particular neighborhood is a downtown or close to a town and really is meant to have more families with it, or is there a better mix of you know, short-term visitors and long-term residents? So all those principles come into play, you know, either through a comprehensive planning process or as you're thinking about the zoning rules and regulations that you're trying to apply to this particular topic, or even, you know, housing development in general.
Yeah, it's in terms of the LUPC jurisdiction, we've certainly heard individual reports about effects on long-term housing, you know, negative effects on long-term housing as a result of short-term rentals. The extent of that, as you can imagine, given our jurisdiction and the information that we have, it's less clear to us than it would be in a typical municipal setting. I don't think we're really clear on how much at least kind of long-term affordable rental housing there's been historically in the LUPC jurisdiction. I mean, if STRs are influencing anything, I would probably say was mentioned earlier, it's building permits for renovations and expansions of existing dwellings, and it's building new dwellings on existing undeveloped subdivision lots. We certainly haven't seen a lot of large subdivision permits during my tenure in the LUPC. You know, we get a fair number of small, you know, maybe fewer than 10 small ones each year. And in some cases, those might be driven by someone who owns a large parcel wanting to subdivide and put up some other dwellings for short-term rental. But I really don't think we've seen a lot of pressure in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, maybe even to build on the vision question, I think a lot of our communities that we're working with are sort of updating comprehensive plans or thinking about, you know, how this fits into the balanced approach that I keep going back to. And we are looking at, you know, where we've started an MDI Housing Solutions initiative here on the island to help coordinate all the 4 communities on MDI to start to think about different and creative ways to deal with this housing crisis that we're all facing. And, you know, we are looking at a couple of different models of things that could help also facilitate, you know, getting people who might typically look at short-term rental opportunity to think about it in the alternative, which is trying to do a year-round rental or something to that effect. So there's a lot of other solutions that kind of play into this approach too, outside of the regulatory approach that we're starting to look at here.
Has that been
So,
effective, Noel? I'm sorry,
well,
Mike.
yeah, we're just starting the conversations. I think we've built some models out that show that it could be effective, and we're trying to do we're creating the framework for that approach right now. But I do think what we're hearing is that there are people that think, hey, let's do a short-term rental because we're seeing that all these people are making all this money doing short-term rentals. And then the application of that use, you know, actually doing a short-term rental is not exactly what they want to do. So, you know, maybe the house isn't really set up for it, or it's a little farther away and they don't get the higher demand. And they could really benefit from doing a rental, but just not a short-term rental. And I think we're also working on some of the narrative approach to, you know, look, just because you're a year-round renter doesn't mean you're a bad tenant, which is also a lot of things that we hear as well. So those are like marketing conversations and tools that we're working on, plus kind of that fiscal offset. So here's an incentive for you to do this at least for 1 year. And there's been some success in other places in the country where that has worked well. They have a lot more, even higher demand than what we have for short-term rentals.
So the town of Greenville is working with our a local economic development corporation and a nonprofit to hopefully develop 28 units that would be a combination of rentals and home ownership eventually. And the goal is to, you know, restrict those by deed, so they cannot be short-term rentals, right? So this will be for attainable housing for workers in the Moosehead Lake region, not just for Greenville. We hope that people from, you know, all the unorganized territories will be able to live there as well. But it's a step in the right direction, we think. To get this developed, the town has secured a grant for the infrastructure for water and sewer and building a street. And we just, you know, moving forward with that. But you know, we have some people that will actually, they'll camp in the camper all summer long and rent their house out for short-term rental because of the income. You know, so it's, you know, they buy a camper and go to the campground up here, and they will just rent their place out. So, you know, that's a little concerning to me, where we don't have enough long-term housing for those people who can't afford the house anymore.
Yeah, just to kind of reiterate a point that Noel made. You know, our data looking at STRs in the UT suggested that most properties are listed for less than 6 months. A significant majority are listed for less than 6 months, and a significant majority of those are rented for 3 months or less. And so, you know, if people can take a look at yeah, what's the actual kind of STR, you know, frequency or use of my property, that might be a hook to kind of, you know, get them to see, oh yeah, maybe a long-term rental situation might actually work out better, especially if that means the property is going to be occupied for more months of the year. And yeah, speaking kind of personally, you know, I live outside of Augusta and have at a couple of different times tried to find a rental property in the area around Augusta, and there's little. I mean, at one point I was successful in convincing someone with a short-term rental to rent to my family and me for the year, but so yeah, it's definitely an issue.
Thank you. I think we're going to switch to audience questions now. Feel free, anyone in the audience, to either put your questions into the chat, or you can use the raise your hand function and I'll call on you. The first question we have in the chat is, do you know of any communities that have prohibited any category of short-term rentals entirely? For example, no short-term rentals where the owner is not physically present on the site.
I haven't seen any in Maine that have done that, but that doesn't mean that hasn't happened yet. I think it's more likely that they're going to limit the number of short-term rentals, sort of based, at least the models that I've been looking at, are based on a percentage of the total housing stock. You know, some communities like Bar Harbor have limited it to 9%, and some other communities I know are working on, you know, those 3 categories that I talked about, and really limiting that vacation rental category rather than the owner occupied or the primary residence short-term rental.
Yeah, we reviewed a lot of ordinances from across the country, and we did come across some like that. definitely cases like Noel described, but also a few where, at least they were prohibited from particular zones within the municipality. I can't recall where that was offhand. If whoever asked that question would like to get in touch, after the webinar, I'd be happy to look into that for them.
Yeah, and I think somebody I just saw popped up on the chat, but there are towns in Maine that have just said you can own, the only kind of short-term rental that you can do are the owner occupied kinds versus the other more investment type kinds. But I think that's true. Yes.
Yeah, I saw somebody put in Cape Elizabeth. I think that I know they just redid theirs, and I think South Portland also has limited where parts of what zones you can have short-term rentals in as well. And then another question, what is the best approach to get a handle on the number of short-term rentals in a rural town?
I could take a stab at that. I mean, I can at least say what we did. We used AirDNA, which they have this market minder application, which is a map-based application, which shows the locations of STR listings. It was free to use, at least at that point. I have seen recently that things have changed. And I know you can purchase data from AirDNA about short-term rental listings, but we were at least able to go into the map, and this is something Eric Larson and I did, and sort of manually kind of scrape or extract all the STR listings. That's how we came up with that number of 569 in the jurisdiction. So that was a pretty large area. It was pretty laborious. But that would certainly be one way to do it, as AirDNA combines listings for Airbnb and VRBO. We also looked at other platforms, Facebook Marketplace and Craigslist, and we just found that Uncle Henry's, they just weren't really players. So there wasn't a lot of value in looking for additional listings there. Very, very few listings on those platforms. One interesting point is that while Monhegan Island does have a lot of short-term rentals, very few of the short-term rental operators are listing on Airbnb and VRBO. Just historically, they've used these local rental agencies with their own websites. And so, that was something that we didn't pick up on looking at AirDNA data. That was showing us that there were about 10 short-term rentals on Monhegan, when in reality there's over 50.
Yeah, I think that's one of the bigger challenges, especially around here, is that a lot of the listings aren't just on Airbnb or VRBO. They're local listings through real estate agents or companies that's what they do. They list short-term rentals. And we've worked with a few small towns to try to tackle this issue, and we kind of keep coming back to, maybe the best approach is to just create a very simple and easy to follow registration process where you require people to just register their short-term rental, and then you get a true count for your community of what they are, or how many you have, or what kinds they are. And it doesn't have to be a burden or a regulatory, hammer. It's really just an informational gathering thing. Although on the flip side, there's quite a bit of negative feedback on some of those approaches too. So it really just depends on your town.
Thank you. Another question, is it clear that municipalities have home rule authority to regulate short-term rentals? There's some limiting language in the provision in LD 2003 with respect to this.
That's a great question. I don't know if the answer to that.
I don't either. I don't know, Tim, do you? I know towns are doing it and have been for several years, but
Yeah, I was under the impression that they did have home rule authority, but I'm not aware of the nuances of LD 2003, and if there is particular limiting language there. And maybe there's someone else that could comment.
Yeah, I mean, the way that we've tried to handle it is through a licensing process. So there may be some, but we haven't really tackled the land use element of it yet in a lot of towns, whether or not we, start to think about short-term rentals as a land use category, and, here's where they're allowed. And it sounds like South Portland might have started doing something like that. But usually it's done through a licensing process.
It looks like the GrowSmart staff and DDCD staff are commenting in the chat that yes, towns still do have home rule authority under LD 2003 to do that. Any other questions from the audience? No, we might be ending a little bit early today. I guess if there's no more questions, thank you so much to all three of our panelists. And we can provide Noel and Tim and Mike's contact information to everybody who attended with the follow-up when we send out the follow-up survey, in case you want to reach out to them with specific questions to your communities. And I also want to thank our webinar sponsor, Kennebec Savings Bank, one more time. And I want to also remind everyone that this webinar was recorded and will be posted to our YouTube page. And with that, I hope everybody has a great evening.
Thank you, Maggie.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Maggie.
you.
Have a good night,
Oh,
everyone.
and the link to the survey was just posted in the chat for everybody. Thank you. Have a good
Thank you.
evening.